Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull, and I'm going to continue with part 2 now. Again, accessing higher perspectives on issues that impact humanity and the alternative choices we can make when we come into harmony with a vision, a collective vision of a much better future. So I'm going to start reading from this book, which is what I call higher perspective. Now, it's a dialogue, so I will at times bring in the questioner, and I'll just refer to him as he. He says, you promised in book 2 you would get into the larger geopolitical issues facing the planet. But I didn't think you would enter into this debate. High perspective answers. It is time for the world to stop kidding itself, to wake up, to realise that the only problem of humanity is lack of love. Love breeds tolerance. Tolerance breeds peace. Intolerance produces war and looks indifferently upon intolerable conditions. Love cannot be indifferent. It does not know how. The fastest way to get to a place of love and concern for all humankind is to see all humankind as your family. The fastest way to see all humankind as your family is to stop separating yourself. Each of the nation states now making up your world must unite. Now, I'm just going to pause it there for a moment and say I totally relate to these statements. That's why I'm reading it, firstly. When I worked as a peace clown, which was not a work that was paid, this was a work coming from joy and love, I had the opportunity to love humanity. I've hugged thousands and thousands of people across the world and connected in non-verbal ways because I wasn't across the language. I did usually learn hello and goodbye in their language. But that love was what inspired me to become a peace clown. And I was not indifferent to the suffering. However, when I was in a space of joy, I found myself able to embrace that suffering. When I went into orphanages, slums, I went into bonded labour places where people had been slaves. I also went to leprosy colony where people were losing limbs. Mother Teresa's missionary of charity in Chennai, near Chennai in India. These were the women that were abandoned. Hospitals, I've been in through hospitals, I've been into jails. I've been into a wide range of places that you would consider to be places of suffering. And yet what I saw in the eyes of those people was a great love, more of a love in their eyes than I've even seen in my own culture. In my own culture, people tend to avoid you. If you're a clown on the street, they get shy, of connecting. Some even get afraid, which I found really incredible, when all you're really doing is trying to be fun. But that was to do more with the psychology of my culture, in that there's far more psychological fear here in this culture. In places like India, believe it or not, they were less fearful. They were very accepting of their circumstances and very generous to you. There was no judgment at all projected. It was incredible. So I came to see the world as my family. When I travelled to 20 countries, I remember being on the plane and telling myself when I landed, Egypt was probably the most confronting because I remember flying over Cairo and just going, oh my God, it's huge. And I was going to stay with a couch surfing host. I hadn't met her. I had to get from the airport to her place. And I was confronted. I saw the pyramids and that blew my mind when I saw these massive geometric shapes and I went, they're not human. That was my first thought. Definitely not. And just that being overwhelmed, the size of it was just overwhelming. But how I overcame that traveling alone was I said, these people are my people. This is my family. This is my country. So when I went to India, my country. When I went to Thailand, that's my country. When I went to Vietnam, my country. When I went to Hong Kong, my country. When I went to Finland, my country. When I lived in England, my country. When I went to the United States, my country. When I went to Canada, I entered my country. You know, when I went to Central and South America, all those countries were my country. New Zealand, my country. That was the last country I went to on my world trip. So when I looked upon all the faces, I literally saw them all as my human family. Because when I'm on the street, I can't pick and choose and say, I'm going to hug you and I'm not going to hug you. I'm going to blow a kiss to everybody who's willing to receive it. And I'm going to hug you if you're happy to be hugged. And I might play, I might juggle, I might muck around, all in innocent fun, no agenda. I'm not after your money. I did it all for free. I still do everything for free. That's why I've lived in poverty most of my life. The vocation I've chosen has been to serve humanity, and there is no job title to this. If I'd worked as a paid clown, then there would have been presumptions around performances, and I wasn't a performance clown, I was a peace clown. And what that meant is that in the moment I turn up, I have no idea what I'm going to do. There's no performance planned here. The world is my stage. So I step out as a jester, because that's what I was and that's what I am, and connect with my family. So I just felt to share that as an amazing experience for me. So returning to the text, he says, we do have a United Nations. This is obviously nation states should, all the nation states should unite, was the point that was being made. And he's just said we've got the United Nations, which has been powerless and impotent, is High Perspective's statement. In order for that body to work, it would have to be completely restructured. Not impossible, but perhaps difficult and cumbersome. He says, okay, what do you propose? High Perspective says, I don't have a proposal, I merely offer observations. In this dialogue, you tell me what your new choices are, and I offer observations on ways to manifest that. What is it you now choose with regard to the current relationship between people and nations on your planet? He says, I'll use your words. If I had my way, I would choose for us to get to a place of love and concern for all humankind. High Perspective says, given that choice, I observe that what would work would be the formation of a new world political community, with each nation state having an equal say in the world's affairs and an equal proportionate share of the world's resources. He says it will never work. The haves will never surrender their sovereignty, wealth and resources to the have-nots. And argumentatively, why should they? The High Perspective says, because it is in their best interests. Just want to sit with that silently for a moment. So that is allowing all the nation states to have an equal say and receive a fair proportion or share of the world's resources. Now, the response to that has obviously been disbelief that people will give it up. They will shift in consciousness when they recognise that it's in their best interests to share. And I might just add in a bit before I continue on here and just state the economic system was a human creation. Prior to that, there was no economic system, and the planet belonged to no one. And in fact, the planet never has belonged to anybody. We all live pretty much till 80, 90 years of age, if you're very lucky. You're a temporary steward on the planet. You cannot own anything. That was a construction to say that this is mine and not yours. It became a separation. Ownership did. And then our status and self-worth, of course, formulated around what we owned and how we were seen. So I'll just continue on. He goes on to say, they don't see that, and I'm not sure I do. High Perspective says, if you could add billions of dollars a year to your nation's economy, dollars which could be spent to feed the hungry, clothe the needy, house the poor, bring security to the elderly, provide better health, and produce a dignified standard of living for all, would that be in your nation's best interests? He says, well, in America, there are those who would argue that it would help the poor at the expense of the rich and of the middle income taxpayer. Meanwhile, the country continues to go to hell. Crime ravages the nation. Inflation robs the people of their life savings. Unemployment skyrockets and government grows bigger and fatter. And in school, they're handing out condoms. And then the High Perspective goes, you sound like a radio show host. Well, they are the concerns of many Americans, he says, which I'm sure he doesn't know all the concerns, but anyway. High Perspective responds, then they are short-sighted. Do you not see that if billions of dollars a year, that's millions a month, hundreds and hundreds of thousands a week, unheard of amounts each day, could be sunk back into your system, that if you could use these monies to feed your hungry, clothe your needy, house your poor, bring security to the elderly, provide health care and dignity to all, the causes of crime would be lost forever? Do you not see that new jobs would mushroom as dollars were pumped back into your economy? That your own government could even be reduced because it would have less to do? And again, I might add a little bit in here. I've written a report called Compliance or Democracy, which I submitted to the welfare sector, the government who handle welfare, so Centrelink it's called here in Australia. And as an economist, what I said, because there's this perception that those who take money from the government are leeching off the government, they're entitled, it's a waste of public money. And my argument was always that they were pump priming the local economy because people will spend where they live. So if you're on welfare, you're going to pay rent in the local area, you're going to buy food at the local shops. You're only going to pay for the necessities because, let's face it, they're earning typically under, certainly in Australia, under poverty wages, which is higher, I believe, than the United States. Probably marginally. They're starting to bring it down as we start to sink our systems, given the influences that are happening now. We're starting to slowly unravel a welfare state that was the pride of this country and really reflected egalitarianism. So that pump priming is really important. But even without that, wouldn't you want to give dignity to your poor? Wouldn't you want to make sure they've got something to eat? I mean, conscience would lead you to that, conclusion that you'd want these things to happen for these people. But when we're coming out of very judgmental mindsets from people who have never experienced poverty, largely, who have decided to take on board narratives that victim blame those people, it's their fault, get up and get a job, they're lazy, all these types of statements get made when there is nothing further than the truth. Most people do want to have a career and have income coming in, and they do want to be able to purchase the things that others purchase who are in that lower economic situation. So there's a lot of erroneous statements projected onto the poor, which justifies leaving them where they are, or measures that are going to diminish their ability to be empowered even more. So that's something to consider. So I'll read on. He says, I suppose some of that could happen. I can't imagine government even getting smaller. But just where are these millions and billions going to come from? Taxes imposed by your new world government, more taking from those who've worked to get it, to give those who won't stand upon their own 2 feet and go after it? Higher perspective says, is that how you frame it? No, but that's how a great many people see it, and I want to fairly state their view. High perspective says, well, I'd like to talk about that later. Right now, I don't want to get off track, but I want to come back to that later. And he says, great. But you've asked where all these new dollars would come from. Well, they would not have to come from any new taxes imposed by the New World community. Although members of the community, individual citizens, would want, under an enlightened governance, to send 10% of their income to provide for society's needs as a whole. Nor would they come from new taxes imposed on any local government by any local government. In fact, some local governments would surely be able to reduce taxes. Now, what's interesting here, I'm just going to note this, is he talks about, High Perspective talks about the New World community. It's a community. It's not a government. And that New World community is the citizens. So a little bit like tithing, I guess, if you're from a religious background, 10% of the community's wealth would go to assisting those who are in hardship. That seems fair to me. He then says all of these benefits would result from the simple restructuring. Oh no, actually that's High Perspective. All of these benefits would result from the simple restructuring of your worldview, the simpler reordering of your world political configuration. He says, how? The money you save from building defence systems and attack weapons. He says, oh, I get it. You want us to close down the military. High Perspective says, not just you, everybody in the world. But not close down your military, simply reduce it drastically. Internal order would be your only need. You could strengthen local police, something you say you want to do, but cry each year at budget time that you cannot do. At the same time, dramatically reducing your spending on weapons of war and preparations for war. What is offensive and defensive weapons of mass destruction? He then says, firstly, I think your figures exaggerate how much could be saved by doing that. Second, I don't think you'll ever convince people they should give up the ability to defend themselves. High Perspective responds, let's look at the numbers presently. Now, this dialogue happened in 1994, so we're talking 25 years ago. It's a long time ago and still nothing's changed. It's really interesting since this was released. But even at that time, it states world governments spent about $1 trillion per year for military purposes. That's $1 million a minute worldwide. It states the government expenditure in the United States is $1 trillion per year, and that's pretty current figures. But there's a lot of subcontracting now. So we actually don't know how much. Well, we can find out. Certainly in Australia, we can go to the Senate and we can find out subcontracting figures. I've actually got them, but not with me now, to understand how much is spent. So it's really high, really high. 1 trillion is a minimum. It's much higher than that. This is 25 years ago. So it would be what, 20 trillion. This is a guesstimate. I'm saying about 20 trillion. Because the more people are in fear, the more people will bring armaments. So High Perspective goes on to say the nations that are spending the most would redirect the most to the other priorities mentioned. So larger, richer nations would see it in their best interests to do so if they thought it was possible. But larger, richer nations cannot imagine going defenceless, for they fear aggression and attack from the nations which envy them and want what they have. There are two ways to eliminate this threat. One, share enough of the world's total wealth and resources with all of the world's people so that no one will want and need what someone else has. And everyone may live in dignity and remove themselves from fear. Two, create a system for the resolution of differences that eliminate the need for war and even the possibility of it. He then says the people of the world would probably never do this. Higher perspective says they already have. They have, he says. Yes, there is a great experiment now going on in your world in just this sort of political order. That experiment is called the United States of America. He says, which you said was failing miserably. High perspective says it is. It has very far to go before it could be called a success. Still, it is the best experiment going. It is, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system, he announced, except all others. Your nation was the first to take a loose confederation of individual states and successfully unite them into a cohesive group, each submitting to one central authority. At the time, none of the states wanted to do this, and each resisted mightily, fearing the loss of its individual greatness and claiming that such a union would not serve its best interests. It may be instructive to understand just what was going on with these individual states at the time. While they had joined together in a loose confederation, there was no real US government, and hence no power to enforce the Articles of Confederation to which the states had agreed. States were conducting their own foreign affairs, several reaching private agreements on trade and other matters with France, Spain, and England, and other countries. States traded with each other as well, and through their Articles of Confederation forbade it. Some states added tariffs to the goods shipped in from other states, just as they did for goods from across the ocean. Merchants had no choice but to pay at the harbour if they wanted to buy and sell these goods. There being no central authority, although there was a written agreement to prohibit such taxing. The individual states also fought wars with each other. Each state considered its militia a standing army. 9 states had their own navies, and "Don't tread on me" could have been the official motto of every state in the Confederation. Over half of the states were even printing their own money. And in brackets it says, although the Confederation had agreed that doing so would be illegal. In short, your original states, though joined together under the Articles of Confederation, were acting exactly as independent nations do today. Although they could see that the agreements of their confederation, and he's put into brackets, such as the granting to Congress the sole authority to coin money. When I say he, I'm saying the dialogue with the gentleman here. He's put those brackets in, but high perspective is simply speaking. In short, your original states, though joined together under the Articles of Confederation, I've just said that, as independent nations do today, although they could see that the agreements of their confederation, I've said that, were not working, they staunchly resisted creating and submitting to a central authority that could enforce these agreements and put some teeth into them. Yet, in time, a few progressive leaders began to prevail. They convinced the rank and file that there was more to be gained by creating such a new federation than they would ever lose. Merchants would save money and increase profits because individual states could no longer tax each other's goods. Governments would save money and have more to put into programs and services that truly helped people, because resources would not have to be used to protect individual states from each other. the people would have greater security and safety and greater prosperity too by cooperating with rather than fighting with each other. Far from losing their greatness, each state could become greater still. And that, of course, is exactly what has happened. The same could be made to happen with the 192 nation states in the world today. If they were to join together in a united federation, it could mean an end to war. How so? There would still be disagreements. So long as humans remain attached to outer things, that is true. There is a way to truly eliminate war and all experience of unrest and lack of peace. But that is a spiritual solution. We are here exploring a geopolitical one. Actually, the trick is to combine the two. Spiritual truth must be lived in practical life to change everyday experience. So often people separate spiritual from practical. You go to church, worship on a Sunday, for some. For others, they might meditate. Or they might have a moment where they remember their spiritual life. But imagining combining them. So that's what I'm doing in my life actually, is living in integration of the spiritual life as a primary life for me and the practical life as a secondary. Even though the secondary is material things that I need, I'm typically moved primarily by the spiritual life, which is my love of humanity. So spirituality is not, in my case, a religion, although I would say if I was to ever depict it as such, it would be based on love. Love is my religion. But thankfully, love is who we are as humans, and we can all join in together. So my way is not better than your way. My way is our way. So everyone belongs in my world. Anyway, High Perspective goes on to say, until this change occurs, so combining the spiritual and the practical, you are right. Yet there need not be wars. There need not be killing. Are there wars between California and Oregon over water rights? Between Maryland and Virginia over fishing? Between Wisconsin and Illinois, Ohio and Massachusetts? He says no. And why not? Have not various disputes and differences arisen between them? He says through the years, I suppose so. High Perspective says you can bet on it, but these individual states have voluntarily agreed. It was a simple voluntary agreement to abide by certain laws and abide by certain compromises on matters common to them, while retaining the right to pass separate statutes on matters relating to each individually. And when disputes between states do arise due to differing interpretations of the federal law, or someone simply breaking the law, the matter is taken to a court, which has been granted the authority to resolve the disputes. And if the current body of law does not provide a precedent or a means by which the matter can be brought through the courts to a satisfactory resolution, the states and the people in them send their representatives to a central government to try to create agreement on new laws that will produce a satisfactory circumstance, or at the very least, a reasonable compromise. This is how your federation works: a system of laws, a system of courts empowered by you to interpret those laws, and a justice system backed by armed might, if needed, to enforce the decisions of those courts. Although no one would argue that the system doesn't need improving, this political concoction has worked for more than 200 years. There is no reason to doubt that the same recipe will work between nation states as well. And then he says, if this is so simple, why hasn't it been tried? Now, before I get to the answer of that, I'm just going to sit with this for a moment because there are a few things I want to say. Yeah, the European Union has sought monetary union through the euro, But this was not a cultural union. The United States was a confederation, same people, inclusive of the indigenous and Mexican, who would have been there. So this is a confederation of states that saw themselves as separate and were very resistant to coming together because of the fear of loss of sovereignty, a fear of loss of wealth. The Brexit issue came up for me when I first looked at this, where the UK is feeling this loss of sovereignty, a loss of income by exiting the European Union rather than working together, learning to relinquish total control. And that's what I feel is the underlying issue there. It also comes from a separated state of consciousness where I'm in it for me, not the greater good of the whole. So the joining, if you like, of that European Union of various countries has occurred because each country has believed it's going to receive an advantage. It's going to make more money as a result of dropping off extra costs and taxes. So streamlining, if you like, those tax bases to create a cheaper union where products and services flow. We tend to have a real focus on the economics of these things. And of course, for those to enter this type of union, they would have to feel a financial benefit for sure, given the mindsets that we're dealing with. But in truth, it's a cultural union as well. It's a movement of people freely through a geographic area. People who are then identifying not as their own nation, but as a greater or supra-nation. In the case of the European Union, the currency, the euro, was what reinforced the fact that they're all Europeans, they would see. So you can see in a way the illusion even of nation statehood. If I say I'm an Australian and then I'm part of the Asia Pacific region, and that becomes a very strong cultural identification, then the fact that I'm Australian disappears. I'm part of an Asian economic social union, if you like, or a Asia Pacific union. Then if I wanted to go further than that, I could then say I'm a world citizen on this planet. That changes everything as well. So everything else drops away and suddenly I become a human being. So identity is created. It's not actually who we are. It's a created thing we all agree on. Or if you're born into a nation state and then you get indoctrinated with that culture as a sense of identity, I'm a this, and we do sport. Sport is another thing we do internationally in order to reinforce those nation states. So nationalism gets reinforced. The Olympics. The Olympics actually, in its essence, was to bring everyone together and to compete in a way that wasn't violent. It was actually to demonstrate to the world that we could actually come together as different nations, compete, and there would be rules of engagement in the Olympics that no one's meant to breach, although there was certainly drug issues where people are trying to get unfair advantages. So that corruption in human nature is evident there as well. So that was one point. The other point I was going to bring up too was the universal income, which I used to be an advocate. I actually believed I'd thought it up years ago until I heard it more and more. Others had considered it as well. So it just happened to be that I guess people were seeing common sense in a universal income, which brings people out of poverty, puts us all on a level playing field. So you're not calling people bludgers anymore. We're all on the same universal income. The way I envisaged it was that once those basics are taken care of, then you can actually focus on doing your dreams. And it's been the case for me because I've remained in poverty because I'm not going into the world really mirroring what the world wants. Even though I have workplace bullying, I could make that a business. Certainly it could be a going concern. But because of my concerns about the planet, I haven't been able to, really work on creating the networks, and I'd have to have a real business drive, which I don't have. The money side of it's always hard for me because I would work for free, and people don't understand that because I really see people as my people. And how do I reconcile on the one hand that a worker is worth $20 an hour, and then I go and do a workshop that's $2,000 for a half day? How do I reconcile $2,000 for me, a half day, $20 an hour for someone else? So for a half day for them, it's what, $80 or $100? That's inequality. And whilst my training might impact 15 people or 20 people, how does my value increase over and above that person working who has many, many talents and abilities, but they're just doing a task? See, I have trouble with the way the system works. It doesn't seem fair to me. So it's not been easy for me to take on that business mantle. And I don't like governing over people. I prefer people to be self-governing. So to be a manager, telling people what to do, disempowers them. And that again works against the true essence of who I am, which is that we're all equal and everyone should be self-determining. We work together collaboratively because it's our nature, but who am I to dictate to people? So the universal income, basic income they call it, UBI, is now being reconfigured to replace welfare. And there are various advocates who are arising who wish for it to be replacing the welfare state, which is not just about receiving an income, it's actually about social services. It's about counselling. It's about special needs. Not everybody on social security is there because they can't get a job. That's the business ethos that's been overlaid on top of social security, which was a social safety net. There are many social needs. From an economics perspective, we cannot attain full employment, which was the promise, many years ago, was that idea of full employment. So it's no fault of their own that there aren't enough jobs for applicants. And what society typically does is victim blame them for not getting a job. And then to alleviate our own guilt, we then say that they're a bludger, they're having a good time. They're actually not. Many of them are very isolated and very lonely. Many of them feel like failures because they're told repeatedly that they failed to get the job. They're also further disempowered by job providers who don't give them the option to say no to something, who are forcing them into work which doesn't bring them happiness and will generate more mental health and down the track, possibly cancer. I wonder about the cancer that's spreading in our society and how much of it is due to our deep unhappiness with life and feeling out of control. Often our physique, our physiology, if you like, mirrors our psychological state. So the universal income, if it was coming from an intent of true equality, supplemented by social supports, and at a level which is not below the poverty line, but similar to the Swedish model, 2/3 of the, you could say the median income. Median means middle. So if the universal basic income was 3/4 of the median income of the society with supports, I'd say go for it. So going back to what's being said here is this idea of a one world federation in actual fact, and using the United States having come together from a confederation to a union that successfully did produce, if you like, in monetary terms, greater wealth, but also a stronger sense of identity amongst a broader public. The more of you that are focusing on similar goals with less inhibitors are likely to experience that abundance. But the real abundance is actually located within the spiritual union within oneself. Egalitarianism would be part of that. Oneness with nature, with life, is another aspect of that. And operating out of a love-based consciousness rather than a fear-based consciousness. That's the spiritual mirroring of a true union. Yoga talks about union. Through exercise, people actually facilitate that union with that deeper ecology, that deeper spiritual field, if you like, that we're all part of. So this gentleman then says that this type of system, this federation, has been tried. High Perspective says it has. Your League of Nations was an early attempt. The United Nations is the latest. Yet one failed and the other has been only minimally effective because, like the 13 states of America's original Confederation, the member nation states, and in brackets particularly the most powerful, are afraid they have more to lose than to gain from the reconfiguration. That is because the people of power are more concerned with holding on to their power than with improving the quality of life for all people. I just want to repeat that, and for those who are or who perhaps see themselves as part of that group of people of power, I just want you to sit with this as I read it. Don't take offense and don't see this as any form of attack or threat to where you're at. See it as another perspective coming to you. I would say from a higher perspective, you've called this perspective to you. In fact, I know that that's true because I see us as one. As I said in my previous video on Five Eyes surveillance, there is no loss. You are full power in truth, but you don't know that you are because you've linked your power to material expansion, material wealth, believing that that is where your security comes from. And what's being put to you here is another way of seeing it, but also having a perspective put to you where the concern for you is to hold on to that power no matter what. And so all the strategic planning, all the donations, seeking of influence is all about, in a sense, alleviating that fear of loss of power. You have to become very clear that you're operating out of fear, which is why you hold on to power. Now, High Perspective goes on to say the haves know that such a world federation would inevitably produce more for the have-nots, but the haves believe this world come at their expense and they're giving up nothing. Do you see the belief? Produce more for the have-nots. That's considered a loss. So we think in terms of credit and deficit, not credit in the monetary sense, but I mean in terms of abundant finance. That's because we've all grown up in an economic mindset that's around monetary well-being. What I found, and this is just a brief interlude, when I clowned on the streets for free, there's no loss for me because I'm not earning anything, right? There's no loss for me if I clown for 4 hours on the street connecting with thousands of people. There's no loss for me. What I found was that people actually gave to me. What amazed me was, for example, cafe owners would pull me into their cafe and they give me food, coffee for free. Yesterday, I went into a shopping centre that's one of my favourites, and I particularly like vegetarian pasties, and there's a really lovely girl that works there, and she always gives me a cheesecake, and it's because she feels so happy when we have our discussions, and I'm always thinking about the highest good for her, and she can see that I really care. And then another owner of a shop who sells coffees as well, I went to see her, and she was discounting the coffee that she gave me. And I remember walking out thinking, isn't it amazing? It's love. It's because they are trying to express their love to me, they actually give me discounts. So what I'm saying here is when you become really at one with love, all abundance comes to you. I mean, look where I'm staying. I'm not paying rent here. I'm living in a really beautiful place. A lady gave me a container filled with dried fruits and food. Another friend of a friend gave me a box of food, which is still going. My mother has sent me $35 a week so that I at least have basic food and petrol. These things I've not asked for. And they've come from what I see as the source of love. So the economic paradigm, in a sense, reverses it. It creates scarcity so that there's always going to be losses in the system. It's like that electronic circuit board that I described in my video, where I saw losses from the system. And in order for that system to profit, that dipole that I talked about, the magnetic positive and negative in that electronic system, which actually draws free energy from a field. This was like a 0-point field, is endless, like a waterfall was that energy. Because of the balance between the negative and the positive dipole, which is like a magnet. The reason I'm bringing that in is when we work in harmony with nature, there is abundance already in the system. But because we have created a system based on scarcity, because we as humans feel a sense of vulnerability, we feel a sense of fear of hunger, for example. I know that in the histories of, if not all cultures, there's been hunger there. We may well be carrying, if you like, collectively, a fear of hunger, of not enough. So that would be called a poverty mentality. So the poorest of the poor are not necessarily those in a poverty mentality. It's often in the wealthiest ones that poverty mentality exists because they need more and more to get this sense of abundance and wealth that is really a mirror of them feeling empty within because they've neglected their spiritual life. They might go to church, but that's not filling up your spiritual life because it can't come from outside of you. It can only come from inside of you. Can you understand what I'm saying here? This is the psychological setup we've all believed as true. There's always going to be a loss if someone gains. There's not. The more you give, the more you get. This is really, in my view, the basis of gross national happiness. Gross domestic product tends to work off resources, providing for our material needs. So it's another way of seeing is what is being put here. I'll continue on. He says, isn't their fear justified and isn't wanting to hold on to what you have so long struggled for unreasonable? Why not? Why not hold on to it is what he's saying.